Welcome to the Bad Boss Brief. I am Stephanie Peirolo.
I'm Eugene S. Robinson.
And we are at episode 49,
Yow.
almost 50, and it's called The Survival Guide.
Mm-hmm.
So we talk a lot about how bad bosses can be better, geared towards an audience of potentially bad bosses or people who don't want to be that. But the reality is that sometimes we have to work for a bad boss, and for various circumstances, for a period of time, we cannot leave. And so that seemed like an appropriate thing to talk about this week.
Yeah, I think, and also too, we got to qualify maybe a little bit the bad boss thing. I mean, I've had bosses that I've understood that were perfectly functional bosses, but I just didn't like them as people. Right? It doesn't mean he's a bad boss in this instance, Dave. Sorry, but I just didn't, his worldview and his understanding of how things should be applied. I mean, in other words, he was not playing to my skill set. And I think, chagrined that he didn't realize that the best use of me is to use me to make your publication more interesting. They don't want more interesting. They don't want any of that. They don't want any juice. They don't want any flavor. He just wanted somebody to check the boxes. And then fundamentally, I realized he's not a bad boss. He's just a bad boss for me. So, but you might want to keep that in mind if you're thinking about it's all them. If it's four of all of them, it's not all them. It's kind of you, and it's a fit issue. But
I mean, yes, and
okay.
I mean, I agree with you that it's always useful, and I'll talk later about to examine our narratives, reframe what it is that we're bringing to the conversation. I guess in my experience, I have certainly had bosses who were unskillful in one way or another, or who didn't. I mean, I had plenty of bosses who didn't like me. That I think I'm talking about in this circumstances, I'm talking about surviving an objectively bad boss. Right. So these are the bosses that were sexually harassing me or others, who were making just terrible business decisions, sometimes doing things that were illegal or on the verge of. I'm talking about really bad bosses, because I think a pernicious narrative that I see just floating about culturally for many years is that we all have unlimited options when it comes to our work environment. Right. That it's like, well, why don't you just change jobs? Why don't you retrain? Why don't you leave? It's so terrible. Why are you staying? Right. And I feel like there's, it's a bit of a stretch, but go with me. People also say that to women in abusive relationships, right? Like, why didn't you leave him? Why didn't you go? Without understanding that in some cases there are, legitimate circumstances that limit a woman's ability to leave a abusive marriage. She might have children. She might be financially dependent on her husband or partner. And I do feel like there are people who are in situations like that with their employment. And I feel like this relentless kind of, you can pull yourself up by your bootstraps, manifest your perfect job. When I was a young single mother who was being sexually harassed at work, I needed my job for the paycheck. I needed my job for the health insurance. And, there are circumstances where people really are stuck working for a bad boss. And that's what I wanted to talk about today.
You don't actually have to, how many times during the, say, 2012 to 2021, or about that I heard, if you hate it so much in regards to Aussie media, why don't you leave? And, completely kind of stepping around the age of the person they're asking, the life situation, as a guy going through a divorce, or a guy with a young child in the house. That's good to keep in mind. But given that ageism is a very real thing, we have both found, I think I got kind of tired. Tired of hearing that.
And
if
again,
I could have left Aussie, I would have.
Right.
So.
And I think that's the same for a lot of people, right? So that's the circumstance, the hypothetical circumstance. But if you are in this, that's really who we're talking to today, is people who are in a bad boss situation, and they want to know how to survive until they can leave. And I think the other thing that's interesting is that a lot of times people can go into a job and there is a pretty significant change. They might go to work for one person or go to work for an organization that they like and respect, and the organization is acquired, or the
Yes.
leader that they like who supports them leaves and or is
Yeah.
fired and somebody else comes in, right? Like I remember being at a startup and really liking and appreciating the founder. And I mean, he was amazing. He was fantastic. It was a great experience until the board, in their wisdom, brought in a
Mhm.
guy who had a good track record, but who
Mhm.
was just, he was very, very sexist. Right. And I had gone to work for the first founder who
Right.
was universally loved, wonderful, respected. And then the board brought in this other founder,
Mhm.
right? There were very few women at the company. It was a tech startup who, in his first day, brought in a plate of cookies. And he said, my wife always bakes cookies for my first day on the job.
Mhm. Yeah.
Right. And in that moment, symbolically demonstrating who he would be. Women were supposed to bake cookies for their wives. They weren't supposed to be starting new divisions or working in sales. And he
Yeah, right.
was a terrible boss, right? I didn't choose that. Right. So I think that there are
Yeah.
a lot of circumstances where, through no fault of your own, you end up working for someone who is just a bad boss.
I tell you that one of my favorite jobs ever and the best boss I ever had was when I was at Apple. And there was a power struggle, and Chris Gulker lost, Chris Gulker being the boss in question. And he left, and I would have gladly stayed. I'm not a sentimentalist. I really like Chris, but I would have stayed. I liked my job. I liked what I was doing. And the everybody in our division uh, had been moved under somebody else. And I ran into this guy in the hallway, and the guy said some version of, "Oh, well, we own you now." And it just really it put me off the wording. And in general, he was a nice guy, but I felt like I had seen the future in a small glimpse, and that is why I made probably the worst professional decision of my life and decided to go to Adobe instead. I should have stayed at Apple because I was really happy there, but I did not like the language. I did not like the intonation, and it seemed to bode poorly for my chances of future success. So I left,
Was
and
that, was he a white guy?
you're funny. Yeah, of course he was.
Wow.
Yeah, yeah. So I own you now. So yeah.
Wow. Well, so let's talk about. I mean, we've talked a little bit about why you end up in these situations, or people can end up in these situations, but what can you do? So, first, I want to go back to what you initially said, which is to really do some looking at your narratives, right, and get your head straight. Only, I'm going to invite a different approach. Instead of looking at ways in which this might be about you, I want
Mhm.
you to flip that, because I think another kind of cultural favorite story is that
Mhm.
we as individuals are at fault for systemic failures,
Right,
right?
right, right, right.
So, and I think that that happens a lot in these circumstances, particularly with women. I will hear a narrative of like, well, I just need to build my skills, or I need to change my attitude, or what if it's about me? And they really will spend a lot of energy thinking there is something wrong with me. If I can improve my skills, if I can get a coach and learn how to communicate more effectively. And it doesn't mean that that can't be helpful, but the narrative of this must be my fault is, I think, ultimately going to undermine any sort of balance or creativity to see options and ways to get out. It's probably not your fault.
Right, right. Yeah, in a macro sense, it's your responsibility to stay employed, to take care of your life and your business. But yeah, this is in micro terms. No, no, it's not your fault. That guy's an idiot. So
And just to look at the example too of, the United States is unique among other countries in that the healthcare is provided through insurance that you get from your employer,
which
right?
sucks.
It totally sucks. And so most countries, healthcare is provided by the government or other, it's not tied to your employment. And because it
Mhm.
is tied to employment in the United States, many people have to stay with their job to get the healthcare. right?
Yeah.
It might be good benefits. They might have an illness. They might have a sick kid. There's a real variety in terms of like what kind of healthcare. There's not a one size fits all, right? If
Right.
you've got Cigna versus Aetna versus one of the Blues versus United
United
Healthcare,
Healthcare. Right.
you're going to have very, very different outcomes up to and including death. So, that is a systemic problem that the
Right.
United States has chosen not to address that traps people on a lot of jobs. And so that's what I mean. Like, just be mindful of, don't blame yourself for something that is a political, cultural, or systemic failure. The second thing is, I would suggest if you have a bad boss, try to stay above the fray. Right now, we are humans and we like to talk about other people. Often gossip can be very supportive. Did that happen to you? Yes, it happened to me. We can kind of flock together in that way. But ultimately, I think that is damaging, right? Those negative messages that you exchange sitting next to somebody on a Slack channel in a, wherever it may be, do two things. One is they just bring your morale down in that you are spending energy and time bemoaning something that you can't change, right? Because if you could change it, presumably you would have. And the second thing is there's a real liability there. I think people forget that our employers can look at every single thing we do,
Yep. If it's
right?
their server, it's theirs.
Right.
Yep.
So they
Emails,
can,
Slacks,
yes,
everything. Yep.
everything. So they can and do monitor, in some cases, your very keystrokes. Right.
Yes.
So they can even see something that you're emailing using an outside, your own personal email. So I think it's really important to, one, for your morale, stay out of the fray, but also just for your safety, to be very intentional about how you communicate, since so many of our communications are actually written, to realize that I try to not write, and I suggest to clients, don't write anything that you wouldn't want like posted.
Read out loud at a meeting.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think there's like a weird mafia element to bad workplaces where I found in weird situations that it's like you're not really a member of the mafia until you do this thing called make your bones, which means your first killing. So that way they have something on you. We know you're really a member of the team, right? So a lot of times I think a bad boss will try to enjoin you in behavior that feels uncomfortable to you. And I'm thinking here very specifically about racist jokes. Now, no boss is going to make a racist joke about, say, black folks to me, unless he's expecting an immediate response or a reaction, which he may or may not get. But it's always been weird to me, and I will not name the company Intel. It's always been weird to me that when I've had a boss who has tried to enjoin me in gossip or idle chatter that affects another, what we used to call minority group, like the boss making fun of Latinos, thinking that somehow that's sad. Oh, I didn't make fun of him or making fun of Asians somehow. And me being in a situation where I realized if I let my actual feelings play on my face, I'm going to have problems. And ultimately, I did at Intel. It's a strange, you have to live with yourself too. But really bad bosses, I think, are going to try to enjoin you in their efforts to be bad bosses. And if I were on the other side of the table from you, I'd say, how do you deal with this? Right? They're not going to let you go. They're going to make sure that they've got a team, and part of that team is rolling the way I roll. How do you, you know, she refers to another employee as a spick. I don't want to laugh. I didn't laugh at the time, but I didn't do the other thing, which is to say, hey, you know what? I can't. If you're going to do that, I can't, which has always made me feel in a weird way bad. And
Well,
we're
but I
talking.
think you bring up a really good point, because I think the challenge is, it's a question of power. And if you have to have that job,
Right.
that to me seems like a reasonable decision. I have also been in circumstances where someone has said the thing or done the thing, and I've
Yeah.
said that is completely inappropriate and lost my job.
Yeah.
Right. And suffered like some pretty serious repercussions. So, and the behavior was not changed or addressed.
Right.
Right. And so, again, it's that pick your battles, understand what your value system is. And I think that there's a difference if someone uses a slur. There's a difference between laughing, adding your own slur, and just having a blank face.
Yeah.
Right. And I think that there is something to the blank face, the extra beat of silence to non-verbally indicate I'm not going there. It can be useful to people who are in a position where they don't have a lot of power. Right. So, and then, another thing is to try to remember why you do the job. Right. So, I mean, I've said this many times, like when I had bad jobs, which I certainly did, I would think, if I don't love the job, love why I do the job.
Right.
And I would think about the fact that this paycheck supported my kids. The health insurance gave them the coverage so I could take them to the doctor. And I was able, especially as I advanced in my career, to have a financial benefit from, somebody was dropping money into my bank account every 2 weeks, and I was able to pay my bills and put some money into savings and, achieve some financial stability that I wouldn't have had otherwise. And so I think, and not in a toxic positivity, we have to be grateful for everything scenario, but to recognize that jobs where we are getting compensated, particularly with benefits, we're getting something from it. And especially if we have other people who are benefiting, whether it's our children, our partner, if we're supporting, an elderly parent, even if we're donating to charities that are important or political, activities, recognizing what does this money allow me to do?
So a tangent question. If have you, if it's even possible to say this, your worst boss, did you quit on that boss or did they fire you?
Gosh, unfortunately, there are multiple. I think of two in particular, and they both fired me.
Yeah.
And in both cases, I got a significant financial settlement.
Right. Yeah. My worst boss fired me as well. And I didn't get a settlement from him, but he's going to prison for 10 years. So I did get the satisfaction of seeing that. So,
right. So, and I do think that is also, that you bring up a good point, right? These were circumstances where we both made decisions and felt presumably that we needed to stay working for these bad bosses because of some of the circumstances we've mentioned. And we ended up getting fired anyway.
Right. Hey, there was one MO. There were a couple of things that kept me there long. When he was focused on something else, I was left alone and could do work that I thought was really valuable. And so that helped. It wasn't 10 years unrelenting reign of terror. If he was focused on something else and I got left alone, I was perfectly happy to tootle in there and do my stuff and then leave. But that's a 50-50 proposition. So yeah, it did feel like a jail sentence to a certain degree.
Well, and I think, one of the things that I have written about before, in fact, it's in my upcoming book. I was just going through copy edits, and it's
you gotta do that. You gotta do that a lot.
I gotta start mentioning the book. It's called
the book. Yeah, exactly.
It's called The Saint and the Drunk: A Guide to Making the Big Decisions in Your Life, and it comes out in the spring. And my publisher says I have to say that every 15 minutes. But there's a part in there that I think is useful here, and it's this idea of neural smudging. Right. And I wrote about it also on my Substack. And neural smudging is the idea that physiologically we have something called proprioception. Right. So like if I close my eyes and touch my fingers together, which I'm doing for those of you that are listening, I know where my fingers are in space because my body has a very accurate map of where I am in space. And proprioception can be damaged by trauma. Right. So you've heard of people who have phantom limb syndrome. They have pain in a limb that has been amputated. I had chronic hip pain and my body stopped seeing my hips, right? So when I would do like an imaginary body scan, I'd go through my body. There was like literally a blank space where my hips were because the pain was so bad that my brain turned off proprioception around my hips. And the problem was when I got back to exercising and going through PT, I wasn't using my hips at all. Right. And so that caused problems in my back and it was a physical therapist who explained, oh, you have neural smudging. Your brain does no longer seize your hips. And the reason that I thought that was an interesting analogy is I realized I did that at work, right? So there were work situations that were so damaging to my self esteem, my sense of competence, that were so abusive that I stopped seeing myself accurately. I stopped understanding that I was competent because even though I was competent, I had had bad bosses and bad work cultures tell me, you're an idiot. You can't do sales because you're a woman. The only, like all of these things, right? And I realized, like, I think that that is something to think about in your bad boss survival guide is if you have been working for someone or in a culture that says you are less than because of fill in the blank, whatever that may be, who doesn't appreciate your abilities and skills or takes them for granted, you can lose your professional proprioception and no longer have the capacity to accurately understand your skills. And that's one of the ways they keep you too.
Yep. Yep. Yeah. That is one instance in which being a raging egomaniac has helped me immeasurably. I never thought, is it me? Is it them? Is it me? Is him? I was always, nah. I was pretty clear that it was them, but you never know. You could be the crazy one. So I had a great and incredible moment of satisfaction at the National Magazine Awards, the Folio Awards. And I remember winning one and walking to the stage past a table of people that I had worked at a previous job when I was just starting out who didn't think, he's not shit. That was largely the attitude because they were giving me bum work to do, right? So it was really great to now be editor-in-chief of a publication and be walking to the stage and getting the award for, and then kind of walk by a table, go, oh, hey guys, how you doing? It was that you should live long enough to have that kind of satisfaction. Yeah.
Well, and the challenge is a lot of us, right, particularly women, we don't have that kind of core self-esteem. Yeah. And I've talked to lots of women in professional situations who I can see have in fantastic skills, who have been kind of beaten down by the culture or the particular work environment that they're in. And they they have neural smudging around the fact that they have, this incredible skill. And what that can do to you is that can narrow your options, because ultimately the survival guide here is you want to try to find a path out. And the path out means, one, accurately assessing what your abilities are, understanding what, like, fairy tales you might be telling yourself, I'm too old, I'm too this. But I think also to really explore other jobs in small steps. When you're depressed and exhausted and emotionally enervated because of a difficult or abusive work situation, you don't have a lot of time to do a full job search. But, try to break it down into, very small tasks. Every week, I'm going to spend 10 minutes redoing my LinkedIn profile or networking. 10 minutes a week on something. Once a month, I'm going to do this. I'm going to send out my job, whatever it may be, to try to break it down into small pieces. Yeah. Find somebody who will help hold you accountable. And then also, try to be creative about it. Is there a solution that you're missing? Yeah. Right? Like, do you have is there some option that you haven't thought about that could potentially give you a break or a boost? And I think finally, one of the things that so my dad died when he was in his mid 40s. And I had this idea that I wasn't going to live past 45, 46 either. So problematic in that I didn't really plan for retirement, but advantageous in that I didn't have a sense that life was long. And so I wanted to make the best of the time that I had. And one of the decision-making criteria I would use as I got older and was out of this sort of intense, I have to feed my children phase, was, is this how I want to spend the last 2 years of my life? Yeah. Right? It's a little bit morbid, but 2 years from now or a year from now, if somebody says to me, you have a terminal illness, and these were the last 2 years that I was on the planet, would I be glad that I spent the time and the way that I did? Why are you
Yeah.
laughing?
No, I know. I mean, I can't think of a single job that I've had where I would say yes to that if I had 2 years left, right? So,
Right. And I think it's a useful and it's served me because I have made a lot of career decisions where had I gone in another direction, I would have made more money.
mhm,
And, I would have had a different level of financial security than I have now.
mhm,
But I feel like I've been living that 2-year rule throughout and have had a really excellent quality of life and, been able to do satisfying artistic projects and spend time with my family. And that is better than working, full time at some crazy job in the throes of late stage capitalism. And
yeah,
again, I am at a season in my life where I have that privilege and I have that opportunity, but figure out what your guide is, right? And a timeline is useful. Staying in a bad job for a year and having a plan to get out is very different than staying in a bad job for some unlimited,
right, right.
purgatory that you don't have an end date on.
I would also add, because this is my stock and trade, a dollop of paranoia. And I'm sure you've read about it, but increasingly, if you are looking, even if it's a casual search, be mindful of the fact, like McGruff the crime dog says, if a job listing seems too good to be true, it probably is. They're phantom jobs, and business analysts come up with different reasons for why they exist. But I go to the worst one, and that's that I believe your bad bosses are trying to figure out who's trying to leave. And so it can be consistent with what you're doing now and you're interested in, but be mindful of the fact that you need to be, let's see, the worse the job is, I believe, the more likely it is that they're going to do something creepy like this, like put out
Well,
fake jobs just to see who's trying to leave, you know?
and even if it's not to that level, there are plenty of job scams.
Yeah.
And we've done, we did a whole show on it of
Yep.
people who are getting tricked into various things.
Yep.
So, what do you have we're almost out of time, but do you have a fire me?
Well, well, yeah, it's what you. I don't know that if you've heard of it, but it is unofficially being called Tittygate, and it has
Oh no, I'm
two.
I'm not familiar, and I just want to name that I'm interested in the nomenclature that you are tossing out in our
Well,
bad boss brief.
it probably has to do with what Mark Zuckerberg, the CEO of Facebook, I'm still not acknowledging Meta as a real company. Facebook happened to him at the inauguration when he was seated next to Lau- uh, uh, Lauren Sanchez Bezos, and it's been weird to see the inside the fence corporate take. I was just bending down to pick something up, and the cameras caught me at a weird
Wait, so
angle.
what he was looking at her cleavage? Is that the idea?
He was photographed looking at her cleavage, but then, of course, because he's become kind of MAGA adjacent, that portion of the community is saying, "Well, look, she showed up wearing underwear. What do you expect?" So it's weird. It's become this kind of palimpsest for like what your political ideology is. So so he's explaining it because by proxy, of course, he's explaining it to his wife. The camera now, people at the Daily Mail and the more kind of raggy papers are doing these like Zapruder like breakdowns of here he is at first, and there he is looking, and there are the breasts, and there. So it is weird that we're spending any professional time on this at all, but it's now into day number 4 of discussing where he was looking, how he was looking, what he was looking at, whether it was appropriate that he's looking. And Bezos this morning responded as well. And I'm like, you know what? Welcome to the next 4 years.
But you know
you
what
know,
though? I mean, first of all, welcome to the next 4 years if you opt into that level of discourse.
correct, correct,
Right. I
correct.
mean, there's a woman that I follow on social media. She goes under the handle of Working Momtra, and she is an influencer who talks a lot about having decent parental leave. Right. And,
Right.
and I like her quite a bit. She's on Instagram. And she said something about Elon Musk's hand gesture at the
Yes.
inauguration. And she said, whatever we're going to do, can we not gaslight ourselves? We know what he did. We know what that is. We don't need to engage in any further conversation. And I do think that we can opt in or out. I actually didn't know about this particular interaction at all because I've been pretty careful about where I'm going on social media and trying to limit that doom scrolling as much as possible. And I think that it is.
So you stayed away from CNN, ABC, NBC.
I actually am. I have not looked at any. The only thing I've looked at is the New York Times and a little bit of Instagram. And I think it's so. I think one, we can opt in or out. But I'm curious. I'm curious. I did see and did engage with the idea that he wanted organizations to have a more masculine energy.
Oh my God.
And there certainly has been plenty of discourse on LinkedIn where I also show up about that. That is interesting to me in the sense that he owns these companies that are very influential in how we get our information, and that he is talking about that, what he's doing with his organizations. Like, evidently, according to the New York Times, you can't find information on abortion providers on any meta product anymore. They're blurring it out, even where it's legal, even, and so that to me is hugely problematic. Whether or not he looked at, a woman's breasts it doesn't seem that important. I mean, what do you think?
Yeah, well, that's the thing, and that's what any good magician does, right? I mean, that's why I said, welcome to the next 4 years, because if this is our professional political life now, it's paying no attention to that man behind the curtain. I get you, great, okay, that's it's. I would be more sanguine about not caring if I didn't really honestly believe, as I do, that as America goes, so goes the rest of the world. So, I mean, they crashed the market here. Whether or not I'm in Spain, I'm done. Right. So,
well, and I do think that, to me, what is worth paying attention to is the fact that the three men who showed up at the inauguration, who have thrown their allegiance so fully to Donald Trump, Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk, and Mark Zuckerberg, control I would almost say the majority of the ways in which Americans get their information. They want to get rid of TikTok, but TikTok has now, also apparently thrown themselves into the Trump support camp. And I think it's just something for us to be aware of. Right? That these are all, to me, from the Washington Post to Instagram to these are all tainted wells. They are full of poison. And just to sort of be mindful of that. So, oh my God, on that light note.
We're trying not to end the show on a downer.
But you know what? I do think one of the things that I think is important is the idea, and this is what, we talk about a survival guide to the next 4 years, is the idea of we do have some agency. We can choose what we believe and where. I believe that there are some news sources that are still not poisoned. Doesn't mean they're not slanting one way or the next, but they are not poisoned. And I also think that we have community, right? So you and I can put this little podcast out into the world, and maybe the algorithms will, slap it down. But I don't think we have that many followers that they're going to notice. And there are people who are listening to us, who listen to us every week, and that is a community, right? And we can exchange information and we can have conversations. And by the way, you all can get in touch with us, WTF@badbossbrief.com. And I think the idea of looking at the structures of media, the structures of late-stage capitalism, there's so many systemic problems. Where can we form community? Where can we lean into one another? And then also, like, this idea that I wrote in my Substack, like, protect your joy. Right? Carve out times to play with your kids and run in the grass and, like, have good sex and eat good meals and dance and have joy, because that is a resistance activity as well. Okay.
Yep.
It's great to see you. And we will be back in a couple of weeks with another Bad Boss Brief. Thanks. Bye.
All right. Adios.
Thank you for joining us for another episode of the Bad Boss Brief podcast with your hosts, Eugene S. Robinson and Stephanie Peirolo. You can check out more of their work by visiting consigliera.substack.com for Stephanie and eugenesrobinson.substack.com for Eugene. You can also find Eugene at Mr. Sleep 3, that's number 3, on Instagram. Reach out with your questions, concerns, work case situations, or suggestions to us at WTF@badbossbrief.com. We personally answer every submission. Be sure to join us at badbossbrief.substack.com every other Wednesday for episodes of Bad Boss Brief so you can gain further insights into your workplace environments. Until next time, don't be an asshole at work.